at least start the recording here, and then it's 6 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get it going, and then people that join us can review the video. All right, so this is the start of week 2. We've already had quite a few things due on Sunday. If you haven't, please make sure. I'm pretty lenient on the first week, but please don't go too far. I will start taking late penalties eventually, but if you haven't, there's the discussions, the introductions, and the proctorio check, and some extra credit availability. This week, we're going to be going over Chapter 10, Chapter 7, so there's discussion board threads for those, and the You Can't Train Ambition discussion thread, and then the 2 labs, the build lab environment, where you're installing Windows and Linux in a virtual machine, and I'll go over the NetLab environment a little bit as well tonight, just as recap. And then the Active Directory lab. Those are all due next Sunday, the 14th. Let's see here. One thing I do want to clarify from the last chapters is I noticed a lot of people mentioning on OEM licenses, which is great. They are cheaper than retail licenses, but I just want to make sure everybody understands that to put on an OEM license, the machine also has to be being sold, right? So if you're not selling the machine, it's not a valid license. So that's why, if you're going to build your own machine, you still need a retail license. You can't do the OEM license. The OEM license is only if it's for resale or you're selling it to somebody. That's the only time you can install an OEM license. So I just want to make that clarification. That's why it's also cheaper, besides the fact that you get no support from Microsoft as well. But the reason it is cheaper is you're supposed to be selling it, and so they want to keep the cost down for the manufacturers of PCs. But that was one thing that kind of stood out. I just wanted to make sure. Before I go into our chapters 10 and 7, I know. Oh yes, Yahoo.
I'm confused about the OEM license. Like if I bought like a new machine now and I install a operating system on it, and I want to sell it to somebody, and that means I need to buy again a OEM license before I sell it to somebody.
Well, no, right. So if you're going to install Windows and you're building a machine and you're installing Windows on that machine and you want to sell it to somebody, you're building the machine to sell it. Somebody's going to buy it from you. Then you can buy the OEM Windows license and install the OEM Windows.
Okay.
It's much cheaper, But if you're building a machine and installing Windows and it's going to be your machine, right? You're not selling it, then you have to pay the higher price for the retail version of the license.
Okay.
Right. So it's just a matter of which Windows license you're buying, and it just matters, are you selling the machine or are you keeping the machine, right? Because if you're keeping the machine, you need the retail license. That's the biggest difference between OEM and retail. Besides the fact that Microsoft doesn't support the OEM, right? So you're supposed to be getting the support or be able to provide your own support if you're installing Windows and selling the machines. You should be able to provide your own support for Windows. So that's why it's cheaper. But good question. Let's see here. Any other questions? Anything else over the chapters 11 and 12 that we covered from last week before I move on to 10 and 7? Okay. All right. So chapter 10 is talking about cloud computing and virtualization and printers. Um, and of that nature. So one of the big things, I guess, the takeaway from the chapter 10 is the hypervisors, the different types of hypervisors. Right, the type 1 is that bare metal install. You don't need an operating system. It is basically the operating system for the hypervisor. And that's what you would use in more production environments. If you're going to do virtual servers and virtual environments for users to use in your company or organization, or customers to use, you're most likely going to use the type 1 hypervisor because it's going to be less overhead, it's going to have more features, and you don't need an operating system installed on the server because you're installing this most likely on a very large server that can handle virtualization, but you don't need the operating system. You install the hypervisor. Type 2 hypervisors, they require an operating system. That's what we're using in our net labs, the VMware. But VMware makes a type 1, but the version of VMware we're using is a type 2. But it requires an operating system to be installed, and it runs on top of it. It's more useful for training, for developers, very because it has a lot more overhead than a type 1. You can still do quite a bit with it. It's just not as robust and full-featured as a type 1 hypervisor. But I do want to make sure that everybody's aware that we're using the type 2 in our scenarios and training. If you wanted to get with the type 1, if you're in the cloud degree programs here, they go into installing and managing a type 1 type hypervisor. But for our course, we don't get into that because this is more about operating systems, not hypervisors. So now you did have a question earlier before we started on the net labs. So need to go in there anyway. So when you go into net labs, you need to make reservations, right? And so I'm going to schedule one for myself, and you would schedule it for yourself. Select my course, the Spicer ITSC 1305, and then choose whichever lab that you're doing, the workstation or Active Directory. Right now I'm going to show you the workstation because I want to show you some of the virtualization aspects in VMware, and so that's installed on the workstation. So when you go to schedule, right, you can pick a day and time if you want to schedule it in advance. So like if I wanted to schedule it tomorrow at let's say 10 o'clock, right, I can do that. And then I can schedule it for however long, so 50 minutes, right? I can go ahead and do that. And then so now I've got this reservation. You notice that I can't enter the lab because I haven't hit the time frame. But at 10 o'clock tomorrow, I would be able to access this lab. So I can cancel this reservation, right? All right. But so I'm going to go in here because I want to go in right now. So I'm going to select my class. I'm going to go to workstation. And if you just schedule it right below the red line, it'll schedule it for immediately. 39 minutes should be enough. I can extend it if not. Now, because I've scheduled it for right now, I can enter into the lab. right? Does that answer your question, Yo?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So you could schedule it in advance if you want, or you can schedule it for right now and then enter in.
So
So yeah.
so anytime you need to use the NetLab, you need to schedule an appointment before using, right? You need to
What's
schedule the time.
I still didn't understand that. I'm sorry.
I'm saying like if every time if you need to work with the NetLab, we need to schedule the time you have to work, right?
Right. Every time, right? Every time you want to work in that lab, you have to reserve it. You have to schedule it. Yeah.
Okay.
That's how that's set up. Yeah. Yeah. It's just. I think it tracks the number of resources and things like that. And so if it got too busy, it would just let you know that you couldn't schedule, right? So it's trying to handle the capacity. But like I said, you can schedule it and go right in,
Yeah.
right? So, but you do have to schedule it every time.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. All right. So password is password. Oop. Okay. And so this right here is our VMware, which that is the type 2 hypervisor because we've got Windows installed and running, and then we installed VMware. So it's a type 2 hypervisor. Um, and just one of the things I wanted to go over, let me see if I can't blow this up here. Um, let's see here. Are you able to see that any better, or did that go off page?
No, it's not clear there. It's okay.
So it looks okay. Can you see that a little better?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to try and go. So if I right click on a VM, right on the tab, I can go to the settings and I can manage that VM. So this is why it doesn't matter what you set it up with. You can manage it later as long as it's off. So it's off, and so right now I've got 2 gigs of memory, but I can have it go up in memory if I want, right? So and eight gigs is the maximum on this machine because of what I've got installed, right? So this blue arrow is the maximum RAM I could give to one machine. Um, but so I could give it 4 gigs, or I can go back down to 2 gigs, which is the recommended. Um, I can change the number of processors, right? So the number of processors right now is 1. I can add as many as you have technically, right? So I could do 2 processors at 2 cores per processor, so it would look like I have 4 virtual processors. Um, I'm going to put this back to 1 though, just because we have limited resources in here. I'm not going to mess with that. But the hard disk, they have 60 gigs, but you can always add hard disks in here. So if you wanted to add, you can add a hard disk easily. Um, and create a new disk, and then you pick the size. 60 gigs is fine. You can name it if you wanted, if names matter to you. And then now I've got another new hard disk, 60 gigs. I can add network adapters, right? So so now I've got 2 network adapters. So now I could actually do multiple networks within in VMware. Um, right now it's set at NAT, or to use the IP address from the machine that's hosting this. Um, but you can create your own networks, right? Uh, VMware has built-in networks already set up, and you can define those networks. One of the easier ways, though, is to do what's called a LAN segment, and you can just create LAN segments. So you can say network 1, right, and then network 2, or corporate, right? So now I've got these networks here, and so if I put this on network 1, if I create other VMs and I put them on network 1, they would be able to talk to each other. They would automatically be put in the same network. So this makes it a lot easier, but there's no real control over these networks. It's just a virtual network. You have a little more control over these. I'll go over there. Let's see here. I'm going to close that. If you go into the edit and preferences, oops, not preferences, excuse me. Edit and virtual network editor. This is where, okay, let's see, change settings. Yes, you have to be an administrator to do this. Okay, so now I can add a network, all right, and so then I have these lists of predefined networks. So let's just do VMnet 5. All right, we can say okay, and then now I have some options where I can use DHCP. I can uncheck that or check that. I can connect the host virtual adapter to this network. I don't want to do that. But then I can specify the IP address and subnet mask, which we'll get into, and it's more important when you get to knowing about networks. And so I can be more granular and tell it what network that I'm adding, and so we can do this. Yeah, we'll just say that's 165. So this is VMnet 5. So we'll apply that. We'll say OK. And close that. So now if I go here into settings, and my second network, oh, I didn't save it. Okay. Add network adapter. And I want a custom, and I want VMnet 5, right? That's the one I set up. So now if I say OK, all right, so now network adapter 2 is in VMnet 5. So now if I power this on, the big point is there's a ton of settings in here. Try to go through, look at these things, see what you play around with, because there's a lot you can do with VMware. It is a great tool. So once this starts up, I'll go log in and then just show you that it's got its IP, so that it gets the IP that we want. Oh my goodness. It's definitely a slow lab. Let's see. I'm gonna push this down. Why? Oh, okay, that's why. Okay. Let's see. While this is loading, does anyone have any questions over anything? Okay. Okay. So I'm running CMD, which will open a command prompt. Oh, maybe. There we go. Wow. Really? Okay. Blow this up. Really can't read it, but ipconfig / all. And so then we've got the second Ethernet adapter here with the 192.168.58.128. So that was the range, um, right? So this got an IP address. It is on network 5, so that's why I wanted to see. Um, let's go ahead. All right. But so, like I said, you can add network adapters, you can add networks, you can add CPUs, you can add memory, you can add hard drives, um, as long as you have the physical uh, uh, memory, you can add the memory. CPUs and hard drives, you can actually do what's called over allocation, and you can actually uh, add more than you actually physically have, um, but up to a limit. Um, and a lot of times it depends on the hardware that you're running, and your usage will vary. But I know that a lot of places do almost like a 6-to-1 on CPUs. So you can do 6 virtual CPUs for every CPU, right? In some cases, depending on your workloads and what you're doing. But memory is one thing that you really can't over allocate. Some have gotten away with maybe doing 1.5, 1.5 times, but you really should never over allocate RAM. RAM is one thing um, that's really difficult to over allocate and get good performance. Um, Hard drives, once again, you can way over allocate those, and until you actually use the space. That's you only have so much physical space, but you can technically allocate as much as you want. It's used space that matters with hard drives. And then networks, the network adapters, you can add quite a few network adapters and networks, virtual networks. Let's see here. Okay. I think that's everything that I want to cover here. Um, all right, so let me go ahead and I'm going to end this reservation and I'm going to go over to the Active Directory. Yeah, I can do that in Active Directory. So let's go schedule a lab. This time we're going to go Active Directory because I'm going to go over our printers, right? So it'll be easier in the Active Directory. And then okay, so one thing I did do just before class is on the server, I created one printer, but I'll create another printer too. But I just wanted to make sure everything worked here in the lab environment. Oh, well, that's starting up. I'm going to start up the workstation too. Okay, well, log in as Bob. Yes. And Control Delete to the server. Password. Okay. So on the server, do control panel. And I'm going to open up my control panel. Close that. So from the control panel, I can view my devices and printers. And you can see that I have a laser printer that I've installed, but I can add another printer. And so I'm not going to, so if it was connected, you could probably have it find it. Since I'm just making up a printer, I'm going to say I need to select my own printer. I'm going to add a local printer manually because that's what I'm doing. If I was adding a network printer and I had an IP address, I could do this, add a printer using TCP/IP, and this is how normal network printers are done on a server like this right here and turn it into a print server. You would usually use the TCP/IP address of the network printer and control it from the server. But right now we're doing a local printer. And I'm going to go with the LPT3, right? Not 2, we'll just do 2. These ports normally don't exist anymore on a computer, but they're there for legacy. They're parallel printer ports. Some of the other things, USBs and that will add ports, right? When you have USB printers. But in a lot of cases, you'll be using the TCP/IP for a network printer. But we'll just create it on this port, I'm just going to create an HP 4250, which is pretty close to what we have in the campuses. Um, it's a good solid printer. And then I'm just going to use this existing driver. This is laser. We'll just do my laser printer for the name. And I'm going to share it, right? So I want to share this so that my PCA can access this. And then I'm going to finish it. Okay, so now I've got a laser printer and my laser printer. This server, right, if I go here and I right click on this PC and go to properties, this server, the computer name is AD-DC, right? That's the name of this computer, right? So one way you can add printers that are shared. So right now we've got 2 shared printers on AD-DC. And so I'm going to go over to PCA. So I'm logged in as Bob Smith here. And I'm just going to go and search and do a //AD-DC, the name of the server. And then I'm going to hit enter. And it's going to pull up all the shares and everything on the server. All right, so I have a laser printer and my laser printer that I've just added. You also have the Active Directory system volume and the net login volume. These are shared automatically on a domain controller. And there's actually a lot of information here, especially in the sysvol folder, that is really kind of bad, that most forget about or don't think about. But if you go into the sysvol, you can go into the domain, you can go into the scripts, and if you had any login scripts or things like that, you could actually get to them, and you could actually, and even in some of the policies, things like that, will have scripts as well, and you can find like user scripts. And you can find login credentials, you can find all kinds of server information, and so be very careful what you put in your scripts is all I'm saying, because on an Active Directory domain, every user has access to read this. And so it can be a big security issue. But we're talking about printers, so I want to just add my laser printer to my machine. I just double click it and it's going to connect to the printer, and now I have that printer connected, and I can print from it. So then let's do a notepad, and let me request more time. This is a test page, right? And then we'll just do file, print, and then my laser printer. See, it's added as a printer just because I double clicked on it. It's added, and so I can print, and so now it goes. I'm not going to save it. So now it goes to the printer, and it had an error because there's no printer, right? There's no printer that exists over there. But what I want to do is I want to go over here on my print server, and because I'm an admin on the domain, right? So there's an error on the printer, right? I can manage this printer from the server. So that's why a lot of times you add network printers onto a server, and then you have workstations connect to the printer on the server. They could go straight to the printer, but then you can't manage the printer and you can't help them out when they have errors like this, right? But so now I'm on the server. This was a job that was submitted from PCA, but I can cancel the job and delete the job, and then it's gone, because I have admin rights on this server, and that printer is on my server. so I have control over it. But I could also give access rights. So under the properties, I can go into security, and I can give certain people rights to manage this printer for me, right? So they don't have to be an admin on the domain. You actually, so there's print operators, right? It's by default, it's a group, and you can give somebody that right, and they can just manage the printers on a server. But that's the beauty of a shared printer. They uh, allow you a lot of flexibility, and also easy, right? It was fairly easy to add the printer. Uh, you could send a link to people, to this printer, right? So this link here to this printer, or laser. Actually, it's easier when it's spaces are very bad, but um, so if I do /laser, all right, it'll add the printer. So all I did was connect to // AD-DC, the name of the server, /laser, and it automatically added the laser printer. So that's what I'm saying. You could send a link or put a link on a web page, and it would do that for the users. And so it makes it very easy to install a printer for people, especially in an Active Directory environment. It makes it very easy. All right, so any questions over sharing of printers or print server management, things like that nature? No? All right. That was basically chapter 10. So chapter 7, we kind of went over networking, right? So if I right click here on the network, I can go to open networks and sharing. And that brings up my network status, and I can do all kinds of things here. But what I'm more concerned with, well, if I had a VPN, I might be concerned with that. If I dealt with a proxy server, in a corporate environment, you might deal with a proxy server where all your web traffic goes to the proxy server, and then the company controls what you can or can't see from the proxy server. Don't in a lot of companies you don't directly access the internet. You go through the proxy server, which goes out to the internet for you, and then retrieves the web page and then sends it back to you, if it's allowed. That's proxy servers, but the Ethernet. So that's what we deal with, and I like the view when the change adapter options. You can do a lot of things in the network sharing center, but I like adapter view, so you can show your adapters. And so I only have one Ethernet adapter on this workstation. Ethernet 0 is what it's called, but I can disable this card. I can disable the card, and now I have no network activity or access, or I can enable the card. Sometimes you need to do that to fix the network connection. We'll go in here under the properties and IPv4 properties. This is what's called a hard-coded address, right? So I'm using the following IP address, 10.10.10.100, which is the IP address that this lab said that we should use for this workstation. And I've hard-coded the DNS server to be the AD-DC server, the Active Directory server. The 10.10.10.10 is the server IP address. And that's what helps with Active Directory, because it needs to talk to the Active Directory server and some of the DNS features. Now I could have done a dynamic or obtained an IP address automatic. That's a dynamic IP, but then I would have to set up and enable DHCP on my Active Directory server, and I felt that that was probably a little too much for this class to set up a DHCP server in addition to Active Directory. But if it were set up, you could just check that box. Well, you know, and then it would get the IP address. Now you'll notice when I check check this option for DHCP, the alternative configuration tab appears. It goes away if you have a manual IP address, but if you set it up for DHCP, this alternate configuration tab shows up. And what this says is, I'm looking for a DHCP server. If I don't find a DHCP server to give me an IP address, then use this IP address, right? And here's the alternative IP address, right? And so I could put this up as 10.10.10.100 with the 255.255 gateway. I'm just going to say 10. Oop. 10.10.10.10. Right. So this technically does the same thing, but think of this if this was a laptop, okay? And at home I have DHCP set up, but at work I need a manual IP address. And so when I take this home, I'll get an IP address at home, but when I'm at work, because I don't have a DHCP, I'm going to grab this IP address. That's what that alternative config says. Let me see if this works here. Oops. All right. Let's see if it. I'm going to have to minimize this so I can get to it. All right. No, so it's not getting it. Nine. DNS server. So it didn't. It's not working. It's pulling up an IP address. That should have worked, but that's okay. We'll just go ahead and hard code it back. 100, 255, 255, 255. All right. Okay. And so 1080 dash BC. Yeah. All right. So we can still talk to the server, so everything's good. All right. So yeah, so that's the static versus dynamic, and then the alternative IP. It's hit or miss, right? I mean, it should have took effect, but what happened is there's a automatic IP allocation process, and that took effect, which it shouldn't have, because we had an alternative IP configuration set. But if I would have played around with it, could have got it to work. But that's what it's for. Is mainly for laptops that move into different zones or different areas and need different settings. And one of them needs a manual static IP and versus one having a dynamic IP. Now, if they both have dynamic IPs, you're fine. You just leave it set it dynamic and you have no problems. But if one of your environments that you take your laptop to requires a manual static IP, that's when the alternative config comes into play. Let's see here. And that's pretty much it for the networking. Let's see. From here also you have the Windows firewall. This can cause issues in a lot of things, especially when you're trying to troubleshoot or things. Pinging between PCA and PCB might not work. Because the firewall is blocking it by default. So you might, you can adjust the rules or you can just turn it off while you're troubleshooting. Typically what I tend to do is I just, instead of fighting with it, I just turn it off. But you have the domain network has a firewall, any private networks have a firewall, and a public network has a firewall. And so you can have different settings depending. So right now I only have one network card, so I only have one network and I'm on a domain network. And so this is showing that my network is considered a domain network, and thus the domain firewall is what is active and being applied to my network connection. If I had another network card for an internal private network, I could have that as well, and it could apply to certain things that I was doing. And then you may have to turn it on and off. And then if I had a public network, which none of these NetLabs doesn't have a public network where it has internet access. But if I had a public network, then this is the firewall that would adjust that network. Let's see here. Yeah, I think that is everything related to these chapters that I just wanted to highlight, besides what's in the videos, right? So just make sure you go over, and watch the video lectures in the lessons folders, week 2. Right. So I've got the chapter 10 videos and the chapter 7 videos, and then just make sure for this week, once again, I'll just cover it. The Active Directory lab is due on Sunday. Build lab environment is due Sunday. And then the chapter 10, the chapter 7, and you can't train ambition discussion threads are due by this Sunday. All right. I know that's a lot, but it gets a little better. The labs are pretty easy, but they'll take some time because the environment's a little slow. Any questions? Anybody have any questions on any of this so far? Yep, go ahead.
No, I don't have any questions.
Oh, okay. I'm glad everybody's using the Ask Me bulletin board. So if you do have questions too that you think of, feel free to do that. You can email me as well. But it's always nice if it can be shared with everybody too. That way everybody else learns what's going on too. So it's nice. You can submit it anonymously too, so don't worry about that. So you can do that. But I'm glad that you're getting good use out of this so far. All right. Well, if no one has any questions, that is all I have for this evening. thank you. I'm gonna stop the recording now, if I can get to the button. Maybe. Oh, why is this? Oh, that's why. Wrong monitor.